it and started watching the video. It said that in some areas of Seoul, where cells of an unknown virus appeared, the government declared an extremely dangerous disaster zone situation. The guys were in the epicenter of the events. The reporter went on to say that martial law had been declared, for the first time in 40 years. Therefore, roads and facilities close to the epicenter are blocked. This meant that the guys could not get out of here. They are locked in, and it is not clear when they will be rescued, and if they will be rescued at all. Jubin's mood had noticeably deteriorated. Yeon-woo noticed this and asked if he was okay. The boy asked him to be quiet, holding his head. Suddenly the boy heard something. He looked up to see what was happening outside the window. They were fire trucks, several of them. Will they finally be rescued and this nightmare will end? Yeon-woo asked Jubin if those were fire trucks. The first thing he thought was that there was a fire in the building. Jubin's mood was pessimistic. He said that firefighters did not come to save them. He added that if he could, he would have set the damn place on fire. But Yeon-woo's attention was interrupted by a fire in a neighboring building. It looked like no one was going to save them. The guy got up and went somewhere. When Kim Jubin asked him, he said that he needed a trash can, but his friend still didn't understand why he needed it. Yeon-woo said it was a good idea and worth a try, but Jubin didn't understand what his friend was talking about or what the idea was. The guy said they should try to create a fire. Maybe then the firemen would come to save them. Jubin did not like this idea. Although he suggested it, he didn't mean it. Burning alive was not part of his plans. Yeon-woo began to carefully examine the room in search of a trash can. Finally, the guy found it and started running to find a lighter and set it on fire. Jubin stood behind him and couldn't believe that his friend Yeon-woo really wanted to do that. The guy stuck his hand into a disgusting trash can full of all kinds of scraps in search of a lighter. Yeon-woo even turned on the flashlight on his phone to see everything better and make sure he didn't miss what he was looking for. Jubin didn't stop yelling at his friend. He still didn't believe that Yeon-woo wanted to set the place on fire, but he was convinced that if there was a fire, they would definitely come to put it out. Suddenly, Kim Jubin's face changed dramatically and turned pale. It looked like he had seen something he didn't want to see. Meanwhile, Jeon-woo reached into another trash can and, surprisingly, found a lighter. The boy shouted with joy. His life had regained hope for salvation. The only thing left to do was to set fire to the bucket and wait for the firefighters. Yeon-woo ran to Kim Jubin to share the good news. On the way, he tried to light a lighter, but it seemed to be out of gas, so it didn't work. As soon as Yeon-woo approached his friend, Jubin immediately began to cover his mouth. He looked very scared and nervous, cautiously peeking out from behind the wall. Yeon-woo did not understand his friend's condition and told him to hurry up and move on, but Jubin interrupted him with a strong swear word. It seems that something happened after all. Kim Jubin saw a zombie monster in the doorway, unable to leave. Had they really been in the same room all this time? Yeon-woo also leaned over from behind the wall to see what had shocked and frightened his friend so much. The boy's face immediately changed. When they looked closely, they noticed that the zombie monster was still outside the door, but most likely heading toward them. They needed a new plan to save themselves. The events moved to the Seoul highway. There was a huge traffic jam because the roads were blocked. The news showed this highway and said that the government was focused on preventing the spread of the virus. Thanks to videos shot by some isolated citizens, the whole of Seoul was drowning in the apocalypse of this virus. Everything was covered with its white cells, as if a spider was spreading its web. This was the news that Jeon-woo's mother read on her phone on the way to his house. She screamed out in horror and told her husband that it looked like the situation was much worse than they thought. They drove up to the road and stopped because the highway was blocked. Each car was checked by a checkpoint. The boy's mother began to quickly dial her son Yeonhwa, but he did not answer the phone. The father said that there might be a problem with the connection, but that was impossible, because their son had picked up the phone before. At this time, Yeon-woo's pocket was ringing and vibrating loudly, but the boy could not be distracted because the monster could hear. Luckily, the zombie monster was still standing at the door. The guys had time to come up with a plan, but suddenly, Yeon-woo's face changed dramatically. He opened his mouth and wanted to scream, but he held back. Something seemed to scare him. The zombie monster moved, but it didn't seem to be going after the boys. False alarm. Jeon-woo watched the monster from around the corner for a while longer. In the end, the guy said he didn't think the zombie monster was going to come in. Perhaps if they were quiet, it would go away, and the boys would continue their plan to save the day. Indeed, the zombie monster was standing calmly at the entrance. Kim Jubin began to panic and complain about how scared he was when he saw the monster. It appeared very suddenly. Yeon-woo supported him in this, but the boy told his friend Jubin that he thought the monster was getting bigger. Yeon-woo went on to say that the white things on his face looked like frog eggs. Then the zombie monster roared. Jubin was very frightened and screamed, hoping that the monster did not hear him. Looking closely, the guy really noticed that the blisters that covered 99% of the monster's body, except for the mouth, looked like frog eggs. It was quite disgusting to look at. Jubin swore and started making sounds like vomiting. Yeon-woo asked if his friend was okay. My friend shook it off, but he looked very bad. Was his delicate nature really that affected by the frog eggs? Yeon-woo asked again if his friend was okay. Jubin assured him not to worry about him. Jubin pulled himself together, looked his friend straight in the eye, and asked him again if he was going to set fire to the building, that the firefighters had noticed them and saved them. He asked Yeon-woo to hurry up and finally do something. The guy looked at the almost empty lighter in his hand and began to think about his and Jubin's rescue plan. Yeon-woo looked at his friend, out of breath and scared to death, and asked him if he thought everything would be okay. After all, one wrong move, and they would burn in this room. The events moved to the cable car. Everything there was covered with mucus mixed with frog eggs. Suddenly, from behind the booth, Yeon-woo jumped out quietly like a ninja. He landed. He looked around the room in the cable car. He also looked to see if the monster was still standing still. Everything was fine. Time to act now. Meanwhile, Kim Jubin stood guard and watched the zombie monster, although he was afraid to even breathe next to it. The boys met and sat down on the stairs. Yeon-woo said he was not sure it was a good idea to start a fire because they could die from breathing in the smoke from the fire. Kim Jubin asked what they should do then. Yeon-woo suggested going to the 3rd floor. It looked like the guy had a plan. The plan was to have one entrance and one exit on each floor. The guys were on the 2nd floor. So while one of them is distracting the monster at the entrance, the other one will go upstairs and start a fire on the 3rd floor. Since the cable car was located outside, the sprinkler would not be able to extinguish the fire, and that is why the smoke and fire would only spread. Jubin asked who would go upstairs. He thought Yeon-woo's plan was quite reliable, so he had no objections. The boys looked at each other and silently agreed on who would go upstairs to start a fire. Kim Jubin stayed behind to distract the smoby monster. He was already feeling sorry for Yeon-woo and cursing him. After all, his friend would definitely brag to the others that he was the one who climbed up, although it was his idea, so he had to do it. You can't envy Jubin either because he was one-on-one with a huge, ferocious monster. Meanwhile, Yeon-woo reached the 3rd floor. The lighter surprisingly worked. The boys were lucky. Suddenly something distracted the rescuer. He heard some strange sounds. He looked up to see what was going on, but there was nothing to see. Jubin was supposed to take care of it, so Yeon-woo didn't get distracted anymore. He said to himself that he believed in his friend. He had to believe in him and finish his work. There was only a little more to go and salvation was at hand. Yeon-woo takes a piece of paper from his briefcase and sets it on fire. The next in line was a sack. The boy was getting more and more excited. The fact that he was able to do it gave him confidence, but the joy did not last long. The boy was not allowed to finish the job because a monster suddenly appeared out of nowhere. Yeon-woo was setting fire to it when he heard the familiar roar of a zombie monster. The giant climbed out of the roof of the booth. Its mouth was open as if it was preparing to bite. The boy, seeing this, immediately ran away as fast as he could. He didn't understand whether it was the same monster that was on the 2nd floor or a different one, and now there were 2 of them chasing the boys. The monster jumped out of the booth and growled, which scared the boy and gave him even more strength and motivation to escape. However, Yeon-woo could not get far from the zombie monster. The giant was literally breathing down his neck, but he didn't let that stop him and kept running. The giant monster let out its white, ugly tentacles from its mouth to catch up with Yeon-woo. The guy screamed. He did not expect to meet the monster because he was hoping for Kim Jubin. His plan was almost perfect. The young man was holding a piece of paper that he had managed to light. Without hesitation, he threw it to the monster right into its vile tentacles. This gave the daredevil a little head start, and he was able to break away from the zombie monster. Yeon-woo was a few steps away from the exit. The boy turned around to see how far he was from the monster, but what happened shocked Yeon-woo very much. He saw that such a huge and strong zombie monster began to burn. He was afraid of fire. He stopped and watched what would happen next. It was a hope for salvation, and at least some minimal safety. The monster burned down completely. It turned out to be flammable, even though it was made of wet frog eggs. Yeon-woo did not move. He stood there in silent amazement looking at the picture. He had just found a way to kill this virus. The guy could not believe what was happening. Almost the entire zombie monster burned down, leaving only the bones behind. Yeon-woo did 2 things at once. He killed the monster and started the fire. Suddenly, the guy's phone rang. Someone was calling him. It was Kim Jubin. Yeon-woo immediately began to brag that he had killed the monster and that it had burned alive, but his friend loudly ordered him to come down. Something must have happened. Jubin said that the zombie monster was gone and he thought the giant had gone upstairs. Then who was burned by Yeon-woo, but he wasn't sure he could go back down. He also informed his friend Kim Jubin about this. His friend did not understand why. Yeon-woo explained that when he was lighting the fire, the monster attacked him, but he was able to set it on fire. Everything was so hot that the fire blocked Yeon-woo's exit. He didn't think about this when he was running away from the monster, but there was no other option. It was either him or him. Yeon-woo ran to the scene of the fire, and once again made sure that he would not be able to pass through. The fire was getting worse, and there was nothing to put it out. The guy asked Jubin what he should do. His friend yelled at him, called him an idiot, and ordered him to go downstairs as quickly as possible, because he had little time left. Yeon-woo heard something behind him and turned around. However, the guy saw nothing. Everything was empty, except for some mucus on the floor, ceiling, and walls. Suddenly, another monster came out from around the corner. It seemed to be the one that Jubin had been following. This monster was huge, twice as big as the one Yeon-woo had burned. The guy screamed and hung up the phone. It was time to run away, and quickly. If he didn't know how zombie monsters were made, he would never have guessed that there was a person inside that ugly, faceless giant. Perhaps it was Gale, but there was nowhere to run. There was a fire behind him and a giant monster in front of him that wanted to eat him. There were even more monsters on top. Meanwhile, the fire was getting worse. There was even more smoke. Yeon-woo had to choose which danger was safer at that moment. The guy decides to take off his shirt. It looks like he has a new plan. The monster was getting closer and closer, but Yeon-woo was not going to run away. The guy set his hoodie on fire. The monster pounced on Yeonva. Its mouth is about to reach the boy. The young man took a swing and threw this Molotov cocktail at the zombie monster with all his might. Now we had to run away. The fire became even worse. It was getting harder for the guy to breathe. The guy wanted to escape so badly that he forgot to throw away his hoodie and kept running with it. The monster's face was tortured. It seemed to melt and melt before our eyes. The guy realized that fire was his weakness, so he needed to burn this nasty zombie monster. While the monster was recovering from the last portion of fire, Yeon-woo swung with all his might and threw his burning jacket at the beast. The jacket was caught nearby. A little more and the monster would have caught fire. Shocked, Yeon-woo stood in a stupor. He had just exhaled a hopeful breath when, through the wind, his life was once again one step away from death. The monster saw that he was safe and growled at the boy. Now the giant zombie giant had a new goal. He had to take revenge on the boy for setting him on fire. Yeon-woo covered his face with his hands. He realized that he had nowhere to run, so he would at least save Jubin, so he just closed his eyes and prepared to die. And then, out of nowhere, a lit piece of paper came flying in. It was unrealistic luck. The arsonist flew right into the monster. It had not yet had time to attack the boy, so Yeonva was saved. The guy stood up. He should have been dead by now, so he hadn't quite recovered and realized what was going on. That was Kim Jubin. He was running into danger, swearing and throwing burning paper to save his friend. The guy made another attempt and threw another arson at the monster. The boy's eyes were filled with hatred and fear. The adrenaline in his blood was going through the roof and gave him the strength to defend his friend Yeonva. And this target hit the monster right in the back. The poor thing growled. "It is painful to be burned alive." Yeon-woo watched in a stupor. He still could not believe that he was alive. Kim Jubin recovered his friend. He yelled at him and told him to run away immediately. Yeon-woo did just that. After all, this monster was twice as big as the previous one, so 2 fires did not deprive it of much power. The boys quickly descended the stairs. The main thing was that the monster did not follow them, and the second floor did not start to burn. The boys ran away screaming as fast as they could. Now they faced 2 dangers, the monster and the fire, which was getting stronger and stronger. Kim Jubin was the first to run. He was not as brave as his friend, so the adrenaline in his blood prevented him from thinking critically and analyzing the situation. Because of this, the boy did not notice the piece of white slime in front of him. If he stepped on it, he would also turn into a monster and most likely burn in this building. Kim Jubin didn't want to die, so he stopped in front of the mucus, but his coordination was impaired, so he just fell face down the stairs. Yeon-woo saw this and ran to help his friend. He promised Jubin his life for his salvation. The guy landed surprisingly on his hands. He didn't seem to hurt anything, but there was another pile of white dangerous virus in front of him. Luckily, Kim Jubin landed right in front of this bunch, so he didn't get infected and won't turn into a big ugly monster that wants to eat everyone. Jubin stood up, but lost his coordination and started to fall. Fortunately, Yeon-woo ran up to him and caught his friend. However, Jubin's reaction was not friendly. He pushed the guy's hand away and told him to get off him. Yeon-woo did not understand why his friend was so angry. His eyes burned with rage. Jubin was seriously angry. The guy kept yelling. He was calling Yeon-woo a snotty brat who thought he was a hero, but couldn't set fire to the place and was sporting everything. If only Yeon-woo had listened to Jubin, all this would not have happened. The guy did not stop. It was as if he wanted to unleash all the anger and fear he had accumulated during the day on his friend. Jubin called Yeon-woo a bastard. He added that the guy was a snotty little brat and nothing else. Yeon-woo was shocked. He did not expect to hear such things from his friend. He understood that Jubin's words were spoken out of emotion, but he would not tolerate such name-calling. It was the last straw. Yeon-woo shouted back and elbowed the guy. Now the boy spoke. He yelled back at his friend Jubin. Did he really want to die? Yeon-woo asked why he was angry with him, because it wasn't the boy's fault that the monster had attacked them all. Yeon-woo added that Jubin was like a scared puppy who could do nothing, because he was so scared and couldn't pull himself together in time. Jubin called him a bastard again. His friend's words had really hurt him, so now he was burning with rage. Jubin did not know how to accept his weaknesses. Jonah's mind was blown. The words just kept pouring out of his mouth, stinging his friend like a bee. He said that Jubin was pathetic because he said that he was the one who abandoned his classmates, when in fact, he was afraid to crouch down and follow them. It was very obvious, but Jubin denied it. The friend called Yeonwoo a snotty little boy and asked him if he thought he hadn't been dumped. The guy started making excuses, saying that he was just a little late, that's all. But Jubin didn't believe him. The boys were about to beat each other up. Then Yeon-woo noticed something that changed his expression. Jubin had already returned. They could not believe what they were seeing. Another monster roared at them from the floor below. It was sucked into a pile of slime that was simply spread out on the floor. The boys screamed at what they saw. They immediately forgot about the quarrel. The most important thing now was to run away and save their lives. The monster attacked them, jumping off the ground like a frog. But at that time, the guys were already running away as fast as they could, only having time to turn around and see what was happening behind them. Yeon-woo was the last to run, so he managed to close the door behind him. The monster remained outside. After clearing his throat, Yeon-woo said they were safe now. It was time to clear the air and figure out a plan of action. The door was closed, so the monster definitely could not get inside to see the boys. Suddenly, the guys' faces changed and they screamed in a chorus. The monster's tentacles began to crawl through the door and attack the boys. The two friends started to run away, but they had nowhere to run. They had to come up with a new plan. Jubin again attacked Yeon-woo, accusing him of saying that the monster could not pass through a closed door. They came back to see how the monster was doing and saw that more and more of it was crawling inside. This process was quite slow, so the boys had a head start to escape and think of a new rescue plan. Yeon-woo ordered his friend to shut his mouth and run. They needed to get to the other side somehow. The boys froze again in puzzlement. They seemed to see something shocking in front of them. Behind the door was a bunch of monsters chained to the ground with white, disgusting slime. They couldn't get out. The guys were trapped. Yeon-woo screamed at the top of his lungs. He did not understand what was happening. What kind of apocalypse was happening in this building? White slime was everywhere outside. The entire building was completely covered with a thick carpet of disgusting slime mixed with dead bodies. Suddenly something squeaked loudly, which scared the boys. Jubin jumped up and down in fear. The guys turned toward the sound. Something from the wall was making a terrible, piercingly loud sound, like an alarm. It turned out that it was a fire alarm. It looks like the guy's plan was working. Realizing that it was just an alarm, the boys calmed down. The fire truck was coming soon, so they would be rescued, and the boys would forget the story like a bad dream. However, something frightened the boys again, and they turned their heads in the other direction. Yeon-woo and Jubin saw black, thick smoke coming from the third floor. It looked like the fire had spread in earnest. It would be easier for the rescuers to find them, because now the burning building was visible from afar. But Yeon-woo took a lighter out of his pocket. He tried to light it. Jubin yelled at his friend. He didn't understand why Yeon-woo needed a lighter. Did he really want to start another fire? The boy said he would try his best to rekindle the fire. He told his friend Jubin to find something that could be easily lit as soon as possible. Meanwhile, the body of the zombie monster was almost completely inside. Only its legs remained outside the door. Time was running out. Yeon-woo nervously tried to light the lighter, but it wouldn't give in. There were only sparks. He yelled at the lighter to make it work. The young man's heart was beating frantically. He had to act quickly to save his life. Yeon-woo begged the lighter to produce at least a small flash of light, continuing to nervously light it again and again. Kim Jubin ran up to the boy. He asked if they had time for this and brought a piece of paper that looked like a newspaper. Now Yeon-woo and Jubin were shouting and cursing at the lighter together, because it didn't want to work. Suddenly Jubin's face changed dramatically, as if he had seen something very terrible. When Yeon-woo saw Jubin's appearance, he turned his head and screamed. His friend began to run away. It turned out that behind the boys, there was a hole in the window from which their classmates had escaped, and another zombie monster was crawling out of the hole and into their classroom. Yeon-woo fell on his friend Jubin in fear and screamed. There was nowhere to run. They had to figure out what to do quickly. Meanwhile, the monster was slowly but surely climbing up the wall and climbing out through the window. These monsters never ceased to amaze. Yeon-woo screamed even louder. He could not believe that zombie monsters were capable of such things. Just then, Jubin's victorious shout was heard from behind the boy. He was running and obviously headed for the monster. The fearless friend was holding a pot. Yeon-woo could not understand what Jubin was trying to do. He swung, screamed, and threw a pot of plants at the monster. The flower pot flew straight to the target, right in the zombie monster's head. The pot broke, making a loud crashing sound. And under the flattened one was a monster. It looked like it was dead. Jubin and Yeon-woo screamed. Yeon-woo could not yet analyze what had just happened, and Jubin could not believe that he had killed a monster and was not afraid. Under the pot, there was white mucus mixed with the earth, like blood. The boys could not believe that the zombie monster was really dead. Jubin turned to his friend and began to brag. He said that Yeon-woo should take back what he said about him. Jubin no longer looked like a scared puppy who was afraid of his own shadow. Yeon-woo said that now was not the time to talk about it and looked nervously at the floor. But Jubin was not deterred by the frightened look on his friend's face. He continued to remind him that he had saved Yeon-woo's life twice. He realized that he should just agree with his friend and say that he was cool. Letting Jubin have some fun might have given him the self-confidence he clearly lacked. Just then, Yeon-woo's face changed dramatically. His mouth opened wide and his eyes looked like two healthy oranges. Something had clearly shocked the young man. Jubin asked why his friend had stopped talking and stopped praising him. However, the boy did not see that behind him, a zombie monster was rising, covered in earth and with a pot on his head, and it seemed that he was not dead. Yeon-woo shouted that Jubin had come back. He was so worried about his friend because the zombie monster was just a step away. When Jubin turned his head, the huge monster had already risen and roared. It seemed to be very angry with the boy's actions and wanted to pay back. Unfortunately, Kim Jubin didn't have time to react, and the monster managed to attack before the boys started to run away. The giant's tentacles were already flying at poor Jubin. Yeon-woo fell to the ground behind him. He watched the monster eat his friend and couldn't do anything. The boy was as terrified as Jubin. All Yeon-woo had was a lighter. He nervously tried to light it. It was a matter of life and death, and the lighter was his last hope. The guy was screaming and swearing at the lighter because it didn't work. He looked at his friend, who was almost completely eaten by the monster. He felt so sorry for his friend. If he set fire to the monster, Jubin would burn as well, but it was worth a try. There was no other way out. Yeon-woo shouted his friend's name, as if to let him know that he was there trying to save Jubin. He couldn't let him be eaten by the monster. Meanwhile, the zombie monster had already reached the boy's face. Was it really the end? The chances of survival were decreasing every second. The giant was very strong. Yeon-woo nervously lit the lighter again and again. A little more and the boy started to cry, but he held on for the sake of his friend. He had to save him at any cost. Jubin's face began to turn white. Frog eggs appeared like pimples on his face. The last thing Jubin said were words of help. He looked at his friend and begged for Yeon-woo to think of something. The guy saw it and screamed. He felt so helpless and guilty for what had happened. In his eyes and cry, you could feel the sadness for his friend. Jubin's body began to merge into one with the zombie monster. He couldn't speak anymore, only mumbled. It seemed to be very painful. Yeon-woo did not give up and continued to light the lighter. It was supposed to produce a flame. It hit water and stone. Suddenly, the lighter finally produced the long-awaited flame. Hope for rescue returned. Yeon-woo just had to figure out how to save his friend. But the joy did not last long. The boy heard strange, familiar screams. He looked up and could not believe his eyes. A zombie monster entered the room, which Yeon-woo had forgotten about while he was busy saving his friend Jubin. But the monster did not forget. All this time, it had been crawling through the door a little bit at a time, and now it was heading for Yeon-woo to eat him. The boy screamed. He didn't know what to do or who to save. Please support the channel, like and subscribe for new episode. But Yeon-woo did not give up and began to react and act quickly. He lit a pot of plants that was lying nearby, hoping that the monster would also catch fire in this way. Fortunately, it did, and the monster caught fire. Yeon-woo's chances of saving his friend Jubin increased. Now he had to deal with his monster. The earth monster quickly caught fire. It screamed in pain, its huge mouth finally unhooked from Jubin. Meanwhile, The boy was hanging on the tentacles of the burning zombie monster. It looked like it was starting to stick off a little bit, and it was unknown whether Jubin would be infected. At this time, Yeon-woo attacked his zombie monster with screams. The boy yelled at him to get out because he didn't belong here. Yeon-woo took a swing at him with a piece of newspaper that Jubin had given him. The monster managed to jump out at the boy. He had to deal with this monster first, and then he would help Jubin not to burn alive. Yeon-woo swung again, shouting death wishes to the monster. This gave him confidence in what was happening. The boy ran up to the monster. He was about to make the decisive blow that would set the monster on fire and kill it. With the words, "Go to hell," Yeon-woo attacked the giant. The zombie monster was flying at the boy. Its left side was already a little hot from the fire that was about to reach the giant. But this did not stop the monster. It attacked further. Its big, ugly jaws were about to bite into the poor but brave Yeonwoo. The guy was very surprised. He thought that zombie monsters were afraid of fire. Yeon-woo expected the giant to get scared and leave the boy behind, but he did not stop. The boy's attempted shot burned the zombie giant. It seems that Yeon-woo did not want to waste all the fire on this nasty, disgusting monster. The giant's cheek was burned. It was blackened and smelled like fried food. However, it was still more pleasant than what those vile monsters actually smelled like. Yeon-woo looked at the monster and burned with hatred and rage. It seems that the monster was not burning enough. It needed a bigger fire. The guy took a swing and threw a piece of flower pot foliage on fire at the zombie monster lying on the ground. The giant monster had just opened its ugly mouth. The leaves of the plant were flying right at him. He was about to taste something from hell, but Yeon-woo himself was frightened by what was happening. The situation was out of control. The zombie monster that was attacking the boy caught fire. Black as its soul, the smoke rose up. It looked like the fire was going to spread. Yeon-woo did not expect this to happen. Meanwhile, his friend Jubin was still lying unconscious near the burning zombie monster. Yeon-woo immediately thought of him and figured out how to help him. He had to carefully get Jubin away from the flames without getting infected with the white frog egg virus himself. When he looked closer, he saw that Jubin was wounded and covered in frog eggs in places. He was not breathing. Yeon-woo fell to the floor and screamed. It looked like there was no saving his friend. The guy started to cry. Yeon-woo looked at this terrible picture and kept apologizing, hoping that Jubin heard him and that it would make his death a little easier. Yeon-woo was hysterical. Tears streamed down from his eyes. He felt so sorry for his friend. He felt so helpless at that moment. Jubin had saved his life, but Yeon-woo could not. The body of his friend was engulfed in flames. No one had ever managed to escape the monster's jaws. Yeon-woo sat shaking and looking at Jubin in his last moments. His soul was devastated, but he did not have to be sad for long. Suddenly, behind him, Yeon-woo heard something very loud. Several more giant monsters stuck to the glass where he was sitting. Yeon-woo was left completely alone and defeated. He did not know how to cope with such an army alone. The guy got up and started to run away with his back. He looked at this picture and did not believe that things could get any worse. Hadn't Yeon-woo suffered enough? From behind the glass, one of the monsters screamed, making himself known. He saw Yeonwoo and now his goal was to grab the boy and kill him. The guy turned to the side at a strange sound and was terrified. A whole army of huge, ugly zombie monsters was approaching him. He wasn't sure he could handle them alone, but he had to. He had to act quickly and smartly. He had almost no options for escape because 2 floors were on fire and emitting black smoke, and a new batch of monsters was waiting outside. The zombie monsters were approaching the boy. It seems that the previous one had opened the door when he was crawling through it, and other well-wishers came running to hear Yeon-woo's cries. Meanwhile, the whole of Seoul was covered in white slime and frog eggs. It felt like a spider's lair during the mating season. The events shifted to the bus that took the teenagers on this ill-fated excursion, which turned into hell for everyone. Hanmi sat on one of the seats and greeted everyone. It turned out that the girl had turned on her camera and started her video blog. Hanmi asked how the others were feeling and if they had seen what was happening on the streets of Seoul on the news. She continued that they barely escaped and are now hiding in a bus. There were many of them near the cable car. Kang Jae-hoon, the headman, came up behind her and yelled at her. He asked why Homie had turned on the live broadcast and asked her to turn it off. The girl replied that she would follow him to the end. Jong Jong-yi wrote in the live chat. He said he was glad the teens were safe and added that he was worried about them. He added that it was no time for jokes in his neighborhood either. The observer then asked if it was normal that Hanmi was now on the live stream. The girl told him that it was perfectly normal, as she thought there were no monsters around. However, Ji-hoon shouted out that it was not normal, but did not have time to finish the sentence. Hanmi continued to tell me that it was a normal school trip to Seoul. At first, all the students were in the classroom. Unfortunately, only a small number of them managed to survive. In the back, So-yeon sat alone. She didn't want to talk to anyone or do a live broadcast with Han-wi. The girl was looking at the floor. Her gaze betrayed that she was heavily burdened with something. Meanwhile, Han-mi was going to tell us something interesting in the chat room. Jong's follower said that if you look at the cells, you can see the nucleus. Han-mi was very surprised by this information. She didn't know or even notice it before. The subscriber added that he had seen it on YouTube. He said that the video conveyed the message that we need to be more careful. Another anonymous subscriber asked if the teens were near the Namsan cable car. He added that it was near Seoul Station. Hanmi confirmed this information and asked what he was getting at. The subscriber said that he did not live in Seoul, but the news had just told him to come to a temporary shelter near the affected areas of the station. Jong confirmed this information and told them to go there. Kang Ji-hoon, the headman, joined the conversation. They could not believe that there was a temporary shelter at Seoul Station. The subscribers added that teenagers should watch the news. Seoul is on lockdown. They thought the class would be able to leave Seoul by train. The teens had to hurry and escape. 3 classmates have already gathered around blogger Hong-mi. Kang-min joined them. He was interested in the information that Seoul was blockaded. He didn't understand what they were supposed to do. Hong-mi thanked her friends for the information and said they were the best. Kang Ji-hoon added that they needed to go to Seoul Station, and Kang-min found the way to it. It was really close. Suddenly, Ji-hoon heard something outside. He felt some kind of danger. He ordered everyone to duck. Chief Kang looked out the window and expected to see the cause of his concern. The teenagers must not forget what was happening around them and that they were not safe anywhere. And then a monster appeared in the window. He was very thin, with a thin neck and a hump. On his head was something strange, like a bird, or rather a pigeon. Hearing the sounds on the bus, the zombie monster turned to see if there were any new victims for him. Up close, he looked even worse. His skin was covered in feathers mixed with white frog eggs and slime. The monster screamed and hissed. He stopped and waited to make sure no one was on the bus. The teenagers quickly all hid under their chairs and sat quietly, waiting for the monster to calm down and leave. However, it seemed that the monster was not going to leave. He could smell their fear and scent, but he was not smart enough to enter the bus and verify his hunch. He just stood there and growled, instilling fear in the potential victims. The headman, Kang Ji-hoon, sat next to Honmi. The girl put her hands over her mouth to keep from making a sound. Ji-hoon was angry and cursed at the zombie monster for not leaving. Suddenly, an innocent cat walked by the nasty soulless monster. The giant reacted sharply to him and returned. It seems that the monster has found a new victim. The cat turned to the zombie's growl. He was not afraid of it because he did not know what it was capable of. However, the monster made its victory cry, which meant that the zombie had spotted a new victim and intended to kill and eat it. The poor animal felt the danger and started running. Cats are very fast creatures, so he will most likely be able to escape from the zombie monster. The giant chased him. The monster's attention quickly switched from one victim to another. The teenagers were saved this time. The teenagers breathed a sigh of relief. The danger was over. Finally, they could open their mouths and express the fear that had been in their veins for 5 minutes. Kang Min said he looked at a map and found out that Seoul Station is 1.4 kilometers away. That's about a 30-minute walk. Ji-hoon said it was too dangerous to walk outside, so they needed another plan. Just then, a woman's voice came from the back seat and called out Yeon-woo's name. It was So-yeon. It turned out that she was still thinking and remembering the boy. She asked what they were going to do with him, because he was left there alone. She added that Yeon-woo had stayed there to wait for them. So-yeon felt a storm of emotions inside. She felt very sorry for the boy, and also blamed herself for not being able to save him. The faces of his classmates were shocked. They no longer remembered the boy. Everyone was thinking about something else. However, the girl continued to speak and added that she had seen Yeon-woo when they were running away, and that he was on the 2nd floor. The last thing the girl said in her monologue was that she was sure that Yeon-woo was waiting for them, and that she could help him even now. Chief Kang Ji-hoon remained silent and thought about the girl's words. It was clear that he was angry that So-yeon was so worried about some sucker named Yeon-woo. Perhaps Kang Ji-hoon also felt something for the girl. In the end, the guy said that So-yeon could try to go there by herself if she wanted to. He said this on purpose, so that she would be scared and not do it. It seems that Yeon-woo had displeased Ji-hoon with something, and that's why he was pointing knives at him. To make it worse, he added that she should think twice, because the situation was not good, and just stood up. He never even looked at the girl. All the other classmates watched the situation and could not believe that Kang Ji-hoon could be so ruthless. The starosta added that they were going to the Seoul train station. He put himself in charge and told them to trust him. It's a pity he didn't act like he was in charge when they were all rescued by Yeon-woo on the cable car. Kang Ji-hoon said that he sympathized with Yeon-woo, but it was too late to go back there. It was suicide. These words did not feel sincere. He said them so that his classmates wouldn't realize how selfish he really was. The last thing he said was that So-yeon should have realized it was too late. In such a place, Yeon-woo could not survive. With this phrase, Kang Ji-hoon wanted to demotivate Seo-young and everyone else who felt sorry for Yeon-woo. Meanwhile, everything in Yeon-woo was on fire. The fire broke out in earnest, because everything in the cable car building was covered with a white sticky slime virus. As here, fortunately, the fire detectors worked and turned on the water. This should have dampened the flames a bit. Yeon-woo was holding on to the wall because he could no longer stand on his own and orient himself in space. He was feeling very bad. There was more and more black smoke. Jeonwoo was choking and barely breathing. He had to live. The fire department was about to arrive and save him. On the floor of the building were the corpses of hideous zombie monsters. Everything was on fire. The room was almost invisible because of the black smoke. Unfortunately, the guy did not make it. He held on to the last, but there was too much smoke and Yeon-woo fainted and fell to the ground. If someone did not save him immediately, he would suffocate and burn alive. For a second, the guy woke up and came to his senses. His body was struggling. He didn't want to give up. Not today. Drops of water from the ceiling fell on him. He was not fully aware of what was happening around him. He seemed to be fainting again. Suddenly, from somewhere across the room, I heard the familiar scream of a zombie monster. Now it was a scream of pain. The big, ugly monster was burning alive. Yeon-woo had defeated him, but at what cost? The boy stretched to stand up and defend himself. He probably thought that the monster was not yet defeated. Then he noticed something very strange on his hand. He lowered it to take a closer look. The guy thought he was hallucinating. It couldn't be possible. Yeon-woo put his hand right to his face to assure himself that he was imagining it and that it was all the effects of breathing black smoke. But unfortunately, no. There were frog eggs on the boy's hand. He did not understand how he could have contracted this virus because Yeon-woo was very careful and cautious with monsters. It seemed to be the end. No one survived the frog egg virus infection. Yeon-woo realized that it was the end. He would die before he could turn into a bloodthirsty, disgusting, miserable monster and not feel the pain of transformation. He looked at his hand and fainted. At this time, the virus on his arm was growing more and more. The process was irreversible. The infection entered his body and spread through his blood and skin. The boy was lying helplessly on the floor of the burning building, inhaling the harmful black smoke. His whole life flashed before his eyes. He caught himself thinking that he had lived very little. His body will most likely not even be recognized, because by then it will have turned into a virus and become overgrown with white frog eggs, so he will not be buried. A miserable death. Now, the whole building was burning with bright flames. Everyone who was there and turned into monsters would die. They won't be remembered, won't be written about in the newspapers, because these people will not be found and recognized. Unconscious, Jeonwoo was lying on the floor when he suddenly heard some sounds that made him regain consciousness. How he wanted to live. He opened his eyes because the sound seemed quite familiar and expected. It turned out that they were fire trucks. They came to extinguish the fire, but it was unknown whether they would find a semi-conscious Yeonwoo. And the guy was already infected with the virus. If only they had arrived a few minutes earlier. Meanwhile, the events moved to the bus stop where the teenagers were hiding. Headmaster Kang Ji-hoon emerged from behind one of the vehicles. It seems that the class decided to flee to Seoul Station despite the danger on the street. The boy was looking around the area so that the teenagers could get there safely and avoid monsters. It was clear in front of them. Chief Kang Ji-hoon looked the other way. He did not want any unexpected trouble in the form of zombie monsters attacking from around the corner. On the other hand, everything was also clean. The previously lively and crowded capital was now so empty and gray. It was completely saturated with fear and pain. After checking that everything was clear, Kang Ji-hoon ran to another bus and hid behind it. He approached the front door of the vehicle. It looked like he had a plan. Finally, Kang Ji-hoon began to fulfill his role as headman, instead of hiding behind the girls' backs. He opened the door handle, probably wanting to get inside. But the cautious boy did not check whether there was anyone in the unknown bus. Suddenly, the starosta shouted to someone, opening the car door. It turned out that he was addressing his classmates, who were hiding behind their bus and waiting for instructions from the miraculous starosta in charge. He told them to hurry up because the door was unlocked. And the class, like soldiers, moved on command and ran to the bus, which was to serve as a new shelter and safe place. As soon as the teenagers ran inside, the headman, Kang Ji-hoon, pounced on them with questions. He asked a rhetorical question about whether Hannah could run faster. The girl was lagging behind everyone else. She was not yet on the bus. Kang Ji-hoon was looking for the key and asked if his classmates had seen him. They started looking for the bus keys together. Hanmi asked the elder if he was sure he could drive the whole bus. Kang Ji-hoon replied that he had 120 hours of driving experience in the game, so he was confident in his abilities and skills. Meanwhile, a very out of breath, Hannah came running. She looked at the floor and barely ran inside the bus. Her classmates were alarmed to see her in such a state. Kana's legs and arms were shaking violently, like those of an elderly woman. She was breathing heavily and could not say a word. Her friend Hanmi ran up to the girl. She was worried about her classmate and asked if she was okay. Suddenly, Hannah started screaming a lot. She said she couldn't take it anymore. She had a hard time finding the words. She added that she wanted to stay here because she couldn't run anymore. Hanmi told her friend to calm down. Suddenly, Kang Ji-hoon joined their conversation. He told Hannah to think twice. Did she really want to give up? Hanmi was shocked by her classmate's words. The headman added that he was sick of Hannah and her antics. The girl's face changed dramatically. She did not expect to hear this from the man who had taken responsibility for the class. Kang Ji-hoon's face was very serious. There was not an ounce of pity in it. His words were like knives. The last thing he said was that they couldn't stay here and that whining alone wouldn't help. Hanmi stood up for her friend. She criticized the words of the headman, Kang Ji-hoon, and said that he could have said it differently. But her classmate did not hear her and did not want to accept his guilt. So-yeon was watching the scene. Hanmi said that Ji-hoon wasn't being an asshole. The headman replied that he was just doing and saying what he had to do and the girl should leave him alone because he was the boss. So-yeon was about to say something. She was outraged by the headman's behavior, and she began to see how callous and cruel their classmate Ji-hoon was. But instead of words of reconciliation, she could only let out a cry of pain. Her face twisted. Something had happened to the girl. It turned out that it was her knee. It was aching terribly, and the wound was still not healed and bleeding. Kang Min came up behind her. He saw that the girl was worried about her injured leg and asked how she was doing. The classmate was sincerely worried about his friend. So-yeon turned her head and was a little surprised. Never before had her classmate Kang Min been so attentive and caring. He told her to sit down because she didn't look good. Before, it was Yeon-woo who was so attentive to her. The girl fussed. She replied briefly that she didn't want to sit down because she was fine. So-yeon didn't want to show any weakness because she didn't know if they would attack her and leave her alone, like they did with Yeon-woo and Kim Joo-bin. Kang Min remained silent. In turn, So-yeon asked what the boy was doing. He was doing something inside the bus. Min answered with a question. He asked if So-yeon knew what the thing was that he had just taken out of the bus and was holding in his hands. He added that he had noticed it recently. Every bus had one of these things. Kang Min held out his hand to hand this mysterious thing to So-yeon. The girl was in a stupor. She understood what it was, but she didn't expect such signs of attention from a guy who had been completely indifferent to her before. It was a red little emergency hammer. It could break glass in case of danger without harming the owner. Kang Min continued and said that such things should be collected. After all, no one knows when they will be useful, perhaps on a cable car. The guy was talking and smiling at the girl. He really liked her. He was a little nervous. It was noticeable. The last thing he said was that he would give the hammer to So-yeon. If they were attacked by monsters, she would be able to break the glass and save herself. The girl was even more embarrassed, even blushing a little. She was pleased with the signs of attention. It was a pity that So-yeon did not see the care in Yeon-woo's actions or did not want to notice it. Their sweet moment was interrupted by the headman, Kang Ji-hoon. He shouted that he hadn't found anything, so he couldn't start the bus. He added that there was no time to waste and ordered everyone to follow him. The starosta behaved like a real dictator. He never even looked at his friends. His true face was beginning to show. Kang Ji-hoon ran first between the next two buses. The cars were parked in the middle of the Seoul road, which was blocked. After examining the area again, the boy ran on. He did not look back at his friends and did not give them signs to follow him. Ji-hoon was on his own. There was an inconspicuous shop with a bus stop between the two buses that the boy had just run between. And Kang Ji-hoon didn't even notice it or pay attention. In the reflection of that shop, A figure could be seen watching the teenagers run. She was an elderly woman. She looked silently at her classmates. Her face was not the most pleasant. The last bus was in front of the class. I had to act as cautiously as possible because there was nothing left to hide behind. Kang Ming asked what to do if they didn't find the keys on the last bus. The headman, Kang Ji-hoon, commanded that they would walk to the Seoul train station. The teenagers had already walked some of the way. Kang Ji-hoon looked out from behind the bus, saw that the area was clear, and commanded them to run now. The first to run was the self-elected leader, Kang Ji-hoon. He shouted for the others to keep up and run after him. Most likely this was addressed more to Hannah, who was a problem in their team. Kang Ji-hoon saw a target in front of him, the door. He ran toward it and did not look back. The boy started pulling the handle to get inside the bus and fulfill his plan. He had to prove to everyone that he could save his classmates. Suddenly, from behind him, he heard an old, unfamiliar voice shouting at him not to open the bus. The fearless leader, Kang Ji-hoon, was scared to death and screamed as he turned toward the sound of the voice. In front of him, inside the bus, the boy saw a monster. This also scared him, because the door handle was about to open. The monster growled at Kang Ji-hoon, making itself known. His scream frightened the starosta so much that he dropped the mat and began to fall to the ground, covering his face with his hands. Kang Min stood with the rest of the teenagers behind the previous bus and shouted to his friend to run away immediately. Everyone was terrified. Suddenly, an old woman who had been watching what was happening came out of the shop and shouted for the teenagers to run to her. My classmates were shocked. They didn't expect anyone else to be there but them. The teenagers were not going to run away and just stood there. The old lady noticed her classmates' concern and called out to them again, telling them to hurry up, because the monster could get out of the bus or the noise would call other zombies. The woman was very worried and anxious, and she called the children for the third time. The old woman began to order them to run away immediately, but this scared the teenagers even more. Some unknown elderly woman shouted and ordered them to run to her. The faces of their classmates showed distrust. Suddenly, a seemingly crazy old lady shouted that the bus was full of monsters. The teenagers had to run away from it immediately. This proof was decisive, and the classmates jumped up and ran as fast as they could to the old woman. Now she didn't seem so crazy. The headman, Kang Ji-hoon, also managed to escape. And all the teenagers ran into the store, falling down in front of the entrance. It seems that the bus full of monsters scared them a lot. The children's hearts were pounding so hard that even the woman could hear it. The teenagers slammed the door behind them. Some of them fell to the floor, and everyone was laughing together. Hunmi said that her heart was jumping out of her chest. She was running so hard. Suddenly, someone called out to the teenagers. It was not an old woman's voice because it sounded young and painfully familiar. So-yeon recognized him and turned to have her words confirmed. She could not believe her ears and eyes. Two other teenagers ran up to the girl. They seemed to be their classmates. The girls could not believe that So-yeon was alive. They were very happy to see her again. Meanwhile, Yeon-woo was not doing as well as the rest of his classmates. The guy was in a dark room alone. He wondered if he had died and gone to hell. According to the boy, hell looked like this. Suddenly, the young man heard something. He still felt very unsafe and listened to every rustle. He did not understand where he was or how he got there. The last thing he remembered was that he was lying on the floor in a burning building. It turned out that it was a huge, ugly zombie monster with 3 legs, similar to the one that killed his friend Jubin. The boy was holding a burning flower pot trunk. He swung it at the monster. The fire was to save Yeonwoo. The guy took a swing at the zombie monster and was about to strike. Suddenly, someone's disgusting hand, covered in frog eggs and mucus, cold as a dead hand, touched Jeonwoo. This course of events scared the guy a lot. He did not expect to see what he saw. The owner of the arm spoke to Jeonwoo. He asked why the guy didn't help him, even though the stranger had asked him to. It turned out that it was his friend Kim Jubin. The guy's mouth was covered with frog eggs. His voice was very nasty, piercing to the bone. It gave me goosebumps. Jubin said that he begged for help, but Yeonwoo did not help. The guy was very scared. He didn't expect to see his friend here, but Jubin didn't look like his friend. It was like he was some kind of demon in front of him. Still, Yeonwoo began to nervously apologize to his friend. The boy took his hand away from Kim Jubin's infected paws, but Yeonwoo's hand had already become covered with blisters from the frog's paws. The boy recalled that his hand was already infected before he died, but Yeonwoo was still afraid and screamed. His eyes widened. He did not understand why his friend Kim Jubin had done this to him. The guy looked at his hand. It was increasingly covered with frog egg blisters. Jubin noticed this and told Yeonwoo not to worry. Jubin's mouth was being eaten away by the frog egg virus. His lips were almost invisible, and almost all of his gums were exposed. His friend told him that Yeon-woo should become like him. Kim Jubin's gaze was glassy, making him look crazy. Yeon-woo's friend added that then they could be friends again, like before. Meanwhile, the frog egg virus blisters were getting bigger. These words made Yeon-woo's blood run cold. The boy's face changed dramatically. Those were the words of a madman. He turned to look at his friend Kim Jubin. Suddenly, the guy screamed loudly. He jumped out of bed. Yeon-woo could not understand where he was and what was happening. He felt as if he was waking up the morning after a night out at the club. He shook it off as if he had just run a marathon. It seems that it was just a nightmare and nothing really happened. He looked around to see what was in front of him to figure out where he was. The last thing he remembered was the fire, the floor, and the Namsan cable car building. In front of him, Yeon-woo saw a few more beds, white walls, lots of folders, and wardrobes. The boy still had a hard time understanding and analyzing. Just then, Yeon-woo noticed something. He felt a sharp pain in his arm, as if his consciousness had only just come back and his senses had returned. The guy looked at his right hand. It was all wrapped and bandaged. Only 3 fingers were visible. The pain in his hand began to grow worse. He was interrupted by 2 adults who entered the room. Both had masks on their faces. One of them, wearing a yellow shirt, seemed to be a doctor. The adults were talking about a manager named Lim, who was supposed to come. Up close, I could see that the other one was an officer. He was asked to take care of this manager tomorrow. They didn't realize that Yeon-woo was already awake and waiting for an explanation. Like here, the officer told the doctor to take a look at the ward. Surprisingly, the doctor was quite surprised. Did he really not expect Yeon-woo to regain consciousness so quickly? Or maybe the doctor didn't expect him to wake up at all, but Yeon-woo was as surprised as the doctor when he saw him. As if nothing had happened, the doctor asked how the patient's arm was and congratulated him on the fact that the guy had regained consciousness. Yeon-woo was silent. He was in a stupor. The man in the yellow shirt told him to make himself at home, but he had to fill out some paperwork. And then one of their employees had to show Yeon-woo a tour of the facility where the boy was being held. But the young man was still not analyzing the information very quickly, so he just stared open-mouthed and silent at the 2 men who had probably come to visit him. He was given a pen and paper. Yeon-woo started filling them out. It seems that the boy was left-handed because he held the pen skillfully. It was strange that his right hand was infected. In a way, Yeon-woo was lucky. The officer controlled the boy. Yeon-woo asked him where to write his address, and the uniformed man told him to just write his contact information. Yeon-woo politely followed the orders of the adults without asking any questions. The officer was very surprised by this. It seems that other patients were not so polite and immediately attacked the workers with a lot of questions. But Yeon-woo just silently followed all the orders. Perhaps he just hadn't fully recovered yet. The man in uniform could not stand it and started talking to Yeon-woo. He said that the boy was lucky. The young man remained silent, digesting the information the officer said. So the officer continued. He said it was really hard to survive now. He added that in Namsan, where the cable car was, there is a fire station, and his friend who worked there found the guy unconscious. In fact, he saved Yeon-woo. However, the boy was not surprised at all. He just nodded to the officer and continued writing. The man in uniform stalled. Wasn't Jonah curious about how he was saved? He had been 1 step away from death, and now he showed no reaction or words of gratitude for being saved. But Yeon-woo's answer struck him. He asked what kind of city it was. His face looked so calm that it was scary at times. The officer's face changed dramatically. He was very surprised by Yeon-woo's question. Did the boy not remember how he almost died? Instead, the officer took him on a tour of the room. It looked like a big gym, with high walls and lots of windows, so it was bright. Surprisingly, there were quite a few people in the building. The officer said that it used to be a gym for local residents, but they received an official letter from the disaster relief headquarters. The man in uniform continued that they were ordered to make this place a quarantine zone for survivors, and to serve as an emergency shelter. He clarified that everyone who was rescued in the area was here. Meanwhile, a man came up to a group of people and shook his hand and asked how the company was doing. He and his colleagues were wearing yellow shirts. A young man from that company asked the employee if all the roads were really blocked, asked what time it was, and whether there was any point in blocking the roads. Yeon-woo was watching. He and the officer were still standing there watching the scene. Just then, Yeon-woo heard one of the patients asking if he could go back to Bundanga. He also wanted to return to Seoul, so he asked the officer about it. Yeon-woo asked strange questions, as if he didn't remember what was happening in Seoul. The officer was a little confused by this question, but he put it down to the fact that the guy hadn't fully recovered yet. Perhaps he had partially lost his memory due to shock. The human body often erases memories that cause pain. The man in uniform told the boy that Seoul was now completely closed to prevent the virus from spreading to other regions. It was clear from Yeon-woo's reaction that he was genuinely surprised by what he heard. He quickly started looking in his pockets for something, even though he was wearing someone else's clothes. He didn't seem to remember that either. He just said that it was bad that the capital was blocked. In the end, Yeon-woo found nothing and told the officer that he needed to call his parents. He asked if the uniformed man knew where his phone was, which he could not find in his pockets. The officer quickly ran to the door and said that Yeon-woo needed to wait and that a man would find his things and bring them to him. Yeon-woo stayed waiting, a little worried. Everyone was acting very strangely around him. He couldn't remember what happened, why the roads of Seoul were blocked, and why the officer ran away so scared. Suddenly, the guy's arm became very sore, making itself felt. The pain was sharp. It felt like something was cut out of it, some part of it. Yeon-woo held it up to his face to examine it. He still didn't understand what had happened to it and why it was twisted and hurting. The guy looked at his arm for a minute and tried to remember. He felt that he was about to remember, because the pain seemed to bring his consciousness back. Suddenly, he began to remember. His memories began to appear in his mind from the end, starting with the most recent ones. He remembered hearing a fire siren. I remembered that I was lying on the floor of a burning building. He wondered who had set it on fire. He remembered that he was waiting for a group of rescuers, but in his mind, he was preparing for death. So he miraculously survived and has to thank this officer friend for saving him and taking him out of the flames. Finally, the guy recalled that his hand was covered with white blisters, as if he had been stung by nettles or several nettles, so the size of the blisters was too large. However, the guy could not remember what exactly happened to his arm and why he was lying on the floor of the burning building alone. He could not remember anyone else inside. He still stood motionless like a statue and looked at his wounded arm, trying to remember what happened on that fateful day. Suddenly, someone called him by name, interrupting his session of digging through the memory gaps, which scared him quite a bit.